Black Retiree's hobby uncovers forgotten local history. The crowd fell silent as Walter Jenkins stood before the town council, his weathered hands trembling as he held up the small metal box. At 72, he'd never imagined being the center of such controversy. The mayor's face had turned a dangerous shade of crimson, and Eleanor Whitfield, whose family had practically built Riverview, was staring at him with cold fury. "Mr. Jenkins, you are making serious accusations against one of our most respected families based on some trinkets you dug up in the woods," Mayor Harris said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "This is hardly the place, not trinkets," Walter interrupted, his deep voice carrying through the packed chamber despite his age. "Evidence, evidence of lives erased, people forgot." He opened the box, revealing a tarnished silver badge. This belonged to Sheriff Joseph Carter, a black sheriff in 1921, a man whose name isn't in any of our history books. Eleanor Whitfield rose to her feet. "My father was a pillar of this community. How dare you suggest he would?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Mrs. Whitfield," Walter said, meeting her gaze. "The letters I found tell the whole story. Your father didn't just erase Freedomtown from the maps. He erased it from history, and people died." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted that Walter was a troublemaker. Another voice called him a liar. His daughter Sarah tried to reach him, but the crowd had become too dense, too agitated. Walter saw the security guard moving toward him, felt the weight of all those hostile stares. For a moment he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 months earlier when Walter Jenkins received the metal detector for his birthday. Evelyn Jenkins watched with amusement as her husband unwrapped the large box she'd placed before him. After 47 years of marriage, finding a gift that would genuinely surprise Walter was no small feat. "What in the world?" Walter asked, lifting the metal detector from its packaging with a puzzled smile. The morning sun streamed through their kitchen windows, illuminating the laugh lines around his eyes. "You've been talking about taking up a hobby since you retired from the post office," Evelyn said, sipping her coffee. "Remember how you used to tell the kids stories about finding buried treasure? I thought maybe you'd enjoy this." Walter chuckled, examining the device. "I haven't thought about treasure hunting since the kids were little. Martin and Sarah used to love those stories." "Well, now you can make some new stories," Evelyn said. She wore her favorite floral housecoat, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Besides, you need something to get you out of the house before you drive me crazy reorganizing the garage again." Walter smiled, remembering the old days when he'd make up elaborate tales of pirates and hidden gold for their children. Back in the 1970s, when they'd first moved to Riverview, there hadn't been many black families in town. The stories had been a way to make their children feel special when the neighborhood kids weren't always welcoming. "I suppose I could give it a try," he said, reading the instruction manual. "Where does one go metal detecting anyway?" "The beach park's old buildings," Evelyn suggested. "Just stay out of people's yards. I don't want to bail you out of jail for trespassing." Walter laughed. "At my age, getting arrested would at least be interesting." After breakfast, Walter called his old friend George Washington, whom he'd worked with at the post office for nearly 30 years before they both retired. "A metal detector?" George's deep laugh rumbled through the phone. "What's next, Walter? Suspenders and sandals with socks." "Very funny," Walter replied, settling into his favorite armchair. The living room walls were covered with family photos, their children's graduations, their grandchildren's births, Evelyn and Walter's anniversary celebrations. "I thought it might be interesting, better than sitting around watching game shows all day." "Well, if you're serious, you should try the old picnic grounds by Cedar Creek," George suggested. "People have been having cookouts there since the 1950s, bound to be some lost coins or something." "That's not a bad idea," Walter said, considering it. "Thanks, George. Just don't go getting obsessed like my brother-in-law did with his bird watching." "Doris says he spent $3,000 on binoculars last year alone." She greeted him with a hug as he entered. "Mom said you become quite the treasure hunter." Over coffee, Walter showed Sarah what he'd found. Her academic interest was immediately piqued. "This is fascinating," she said, examining the badge. "A black sheriff in 1921 in this county, that would have been extremely unusual for the time." "That's what I thought," Walter agreed. "There's no mention of him or this Freedomtown in any local history I've ever seen." Sarah's expression grew serious. "Unfortunately, that's not uncommon. Black communities have been erased from local histories all across the country. Sometimes they were destroyed by violence, like the Tulsa massacre in 1921. Other times they were displaced through more legal means, eminent domain, rezoning, infrastructure projects." The letter mentions threats and being forced to vacate, Walter said. And the Whitfield name, Sarah nodded thoughtfully. The timing would fit with the Great Migration period when many Black Americans were leaving the South, but some established communities fought to stay. So what do I do with this information? Walter asked. If I were you, Sarah said, I'd try to find out more about Sheriff Carter and Freedomtown before approaching the Whitfield family or going public. County records, newspaper archives, maybe even church records might help. Over the next few weeks, Walter became consumed with uncovering the truth about Freedomtown. He spent mornings at the county courthouse reviewing old property records and afternoons at the library scrolling through microfiche of newspapers from the 1920s. Evelyn watched his growing obsession with a mixture of support and concern. "I've never seen you so fired up about something," she commented one evening as Walter spread his research across the kitchen table. "Not since you led that petition drive to integrate the public pool back in '83. Walter looked up from a property deed he'd been studying. "This matters, Evelyn. A whole community of people, our people, were seemingly wiped off the map. Their stories deserve to be told." Evelyn sat beside him and took his hand. "I agree. Just be careful. The Whitfields still have a lot of influence in this town." Walter's research began to yield results. He discovered that Freedomtown had indeed existed, a self-sufficient Black community of about 30 families established after the Civil War by formerly enslaved people. By 1920, it had its own school, church, and sheriff. The trail went cold after 1927, however. Suddenly, there were no more mentions of Freedomtown in any public records. The property deeds showed that the entire area had been purchased by Whitfield Manufacturing in 1928 for an industrial development project. Walter needed more information. On a warm May afternoon, he visited New Hope Baptist Church, the oldest Black church in Riverview, hoping its records might contain some answers. Reverend Michael Johnson, a man in his 60s who had led the congregation for over 20 years, welcomed Walter into his office. "Freedomtown," the Reverend repeated when Walter explained his quest. "I've heard whispers but nothing concrete. Let me ask Mother Tanner. If anyone would know, it's her." Reverend Johnson led Walter to a small room where an elderly woman was sorting through choir robes. Agnes Tanner was 97 years old and had been a member of New Hope since childhood. "Mother Tanner," the Reverend said gently, "this is Walter Jenkins. He's asking about Freedomtown." The old woman's hands stilled. She looked up, her cloudy eyes focusing on Walter with sudden intensity. "Why are you asking about that place?" she asked, her voice stronger than her frail appearance suggested. Walter explained about finding the box with Sheriff Carter's badge. Mother Tanner was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Joseph Carter was my uncle. I was just a child when it happened." Walter and Reverend Johnson exchanged surprised glances. "When what happened, Mother Tanner?" the Reverend asked gently. "The burning," she replied. "The night they came and burned Freedomtown to the ground." Walter felt a chill despite the warm day. "Who came?" "Men in hoods," Mother Tanner said. "They'd been threatening us for weeks. Mr. Whitfield wanted our land for his factory. When people refused to sell, the threats started. Uncle Joseph tried to protect everyone, but there were too many of them." Her gnarled hands twisted in her lap. "They came at night, set fire to the homes on the edge of town first. As people ran out, they were beaten. Some were shot. Uncle Joseph confronted them, and I never saw him again." "How many people died?" Walter asked, his throat tight. 17, Mother Tanner replied without hesitation. "Including 5 children, the rest of us scattered. Some went north. Some, like my family, moved to the colored section of Riverview and tried to forget." "Why isn't this in any history book?" Reverend Johnson asked, clearly shaken. "Mr. Whitfield owned the newspaper, the mayor, the police chief," Mother Tanner said simply. "The story was that Freedomtown folks had agreed to relocate for the good of progress. Anyone who said different faced consequences." "Do you have any proof of what happened?" Walter asked gently. "Anything that could verify your account?" Mother Tanner shook her head. "Just memories. No one wanted to talk about it. Too painful, too dangerous." Walter showed her the photograph of Sheriff Carter. Mother Tanner's eyes filled with tears as she touched the image of her uncle. "May I keep this?" Walter asked. "I want to make sure people know what really happened." Mother Tanner nodded. "It's time the truth was told. I'm the last one left who remembers." Over the next few weeks, Walter continued his investigation. He returned to the site where he'd found the box and discovered more artifacts: charred wood, melted glass, items consistent with Mother Tanner's account of a fire. He collected oral histories from elderly Black residents of Riverview, some of whom had parents or grandparents who had mentioned Freedomtown in hushed tones. Bit by bit, he pieced together the community's history and its violent end. The breakthrough came when Walter visited a nursing home in a neighboring county. A retired journalist named Frank Miller had worked at the Riverview Gazette in the 1950s and had heard rumors about Freedomtown. In his attic, he had kept something his editor had ordered him to destroy, photographs taken the morning after the attack. The images were horrifying: burned buildings, injured people, and in one, the unmistakable figure of Harrison Whitfield, Eleanor's father, observing the destruction alongside hooded men. Walter now had enough evidence to bring the story to light. He compiled his findings into a detailed report, including the photographs, artifacts, and testimonies. When Evelyn read it, she was silent for a long time. "What are you going to do with this?" she finally asked. "The truth needs to be known," Walter replied. "I'm going to present it at the next town council meeting. They're discussing plans to expand the Whitfield Industrial Park. People should know what happened on that land." "Walter," Evelyn said carefully, "this will cause an uproar. The Whitfields won't take this lying down." "I'm 72 years old, Evelyn," Walter said firmly. "I've spent my life being cautious, playing by the rules. But those 17 people who died, they deserve justice, even if it's just the justice of being remembered." Sarah drove down to support her father when she heard his plans. She helped him organize his presentation and prepare for possible pushback. "The university would be interested in documenting this history properly," she told him. "This could lead to a memorial, educational programs, maybe even some form of reparations for descendants." The day before the town council meeting, Walter received an unexpected visitor. Eleanor Whitfield herself, elegant despite her 85 years, arrived at his door. "Mr. Jenkins," she said when Walter answered, "I understand you're planning to make some accusations about my family at tomorrow's meeting." Walter invited her in, maintaining his composure though his heart was racing. Evelyn appeared from the kitchen, standing supportively at her husband's side. "Not accusations, Mrs. Whitfield," Walter replied. "Historical facts." Eleanor's perfectly manicured hands gripped her handbag tightly. "My father built this town into what it is today. His legacy has provided jobs, healthcare, education, and it was built on the destruction of Freedomtown," Walter interrupted gently. "On the deaths of 17 people." Eleanor's face hardened. "Those were different times, Mr. Jenkins. Decisions were made for the greater good." "Murder is never for the greater good," Walter replied. "What do you want?" Eleanor asked bluntly. "Money, a position on one of the foundation boards?" Walter felt a surge of anger but kept his voice steady. "I want the truth acknowledged. I want a memorial for those who died. I want Freedomtown in the history books." "Impossible," Eleanor said. "You'll destroy my family's name based on the ramblings of senile old people and some questionable artifacts." "I have photographs," Walter said quietly. "Your father was there the night Freedomtown burned." Eleanor paled slightly but quickly recovered her composure. "Be very careful, Mr. Jenkins. Defamation is a serious matter." "So is murder," Walter replied. "So is erasing people from history." After Eleanor left, Evelyn embraced her husband. "Are you sure about this?" "She practically threatened you," Walter nodded. "More sure than ever." And so we returned to where we started, with Walter standing before the town council, holding the sheriff's badge and facing a hostile crowd. "My father didn't just erase Freedomtown from the maps," Walter continued, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "He erased it from history, and people died." Eleanor Whitfield's cold fury was palpable. "You have no proof of these wild claims." Walter nodded to Sarah, who stepped forward with a folder. "Actually, I do." He pulled out the photographs Frank Miller had preserved. "These were taken the morning after Freedomtown was burned. That's your father, Mrs. Whitfield, standing with members of the Klan." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Mayor Harris tried to restore order, but the crowd was too agitated. "Furthermore," Walter continued when he could be heard again, "I've collected testimonies from several elders, including Agnes Tanner, niece of Sheriff Carter, who witnessed the attack as a child." He gestured to where Mother Tanner sat in her wheelchair, her chin held high. "She is the last living witness to what happened that night." Eleanor Whitfield's composure finally broke. "My father did what was necessary for progress. Those people were offered fair compensation. They chose violence when they refused to move." A hush fell over the room at this inadvertent admission. Walter looked directly at Eleanor. "So you knew, all this time you knew what happened?" "Everyone who mattered knew," Eleanor snapped. "And no one cared until you started digging up the past." Mayor Harris tried to regain control of the meeting. "This is highly irregular. The council isn't the place for these historical debates. When is the place?" Walter asked. "When the industrial park expansion is built over the unmarked graves, when the last person who remembers is gone. This isn't just history, it's a crime that's never been acknowledged." A young black woman stood up from the audience. My great-grandfather's name was Samuel Turner. Family stories say he lived in a settlement that was burned down, but we never knew the details. Was he one of those killed? Walter checked his notes. Samuel Turner is listed among those who died trying to save the church, ma'am. Tears filled the woman's eyes. All these years, we didn't even know where he was buried. One by one, other community members rose, some black, some white, asking questions, offering support, demanding answers. The mood in the room shifted. An elderly white man who Walter recognized as a retired judge spoke up. I propose that the council authorize a full historical investigation into these events, with the findings to be made public. If what Mr. Jenkins says is true, we owe it to those victims and to ourselves to acknowledge this dark chapter. Mayor Harris, seeing which way the wind was blowing, reluctantly agreed to put it to a vote. The motion passed, with only Alina Whitfield and 2 council members voting against it. As the meeting adjourned, people crowded around Walter, some to offer support, others to share fragments of stories they'd heard from parents or grandparents about Freedomtown. Sarah squeezed her father's hand. "You did it, Dad." Walter looked across the room to where Mother Tanner sat, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "No," he said softly. "They did it. We're just making sure they're finally heard." In the months that followed, Walter's discovery led to significant changes in Riverview. A historical commission was established to formally document the history of Freedomtown. The university, with Sarah's leadership, created an oral history project to record the testimonies of elderly residents who had family connections to the lost community. The planned industrial park expansion was redesigned to preserve the site where Freedomtown had stood. Instead, a memorial park was created, with the names of the 17 victims engraved on a stone monument. Alina Whitfield initially fought these developments, but as more evidence emerged confirming Walter's account, her opposition weakened. Eventually, in a surprising turn, she established a scholarship fund for descendants of Freedomtown residents. Not out of guilt, she insisted at the dedication ceremony, but because we must all find ways to move forward together. Walter knew her concession came as much from public pressure as from genuine remorse, but he accepted it as progress nonetheless. On a warm autumn day, Walter stood beside Mother Tanner at the dedication of the Freedomtown Memorial Park. The old woman reached for his hand. "My uncle would be proud," she said, gazing at the bronze statue of Sheriff Joseph Carter that stood at the park's entrance. "Not just of this place, but of you. You found him when no one was even looking." Walter thought about the metal detector that had started it all, now displayed in a glass case in the new Riverview Historical Center alongside the artifacts he'd discovered. "Sometimes," he replied, "we find things we didn't even know were lost." The ceremony concluded with a choir from New Hope Baptist Church singing, "Lift Every Voice and Sing," the song echoing across the land where Freedomtown had once stood proud and free. As Walter looked out over the gathered crowd, black and white, young and old, descendants of Freedomtown residents alongside descendants of those who had destroyed it, he reflected on how the past is never truly buried. It waits patiently to be discovered, to be acknowledged, to be honored. His simple hobby had unearthed not just artifacts, but truth, a truth that had the power to heal old wounds and create a more honest future. That evening, as Walter and Evelyn sat on their porch watching the sunset, she took his hand. "What will you do now that this chapter is closing?" Walter smiled. "I think I'll keep metal detecting. There are more stories buried out there waiting to be found." "Just promise me the next one won't involve taking on the most powerful family in town," Evelyn said with a chuckle. Walter laughed. "I'll try, but you know me. I've never been good at leaving well enough alone." As darkness fell, Walter thought of Sheriff Carter and the residents of Freedomtown. Their lives had been cut short, their community erased, but now they had reclaimed their place in history. Sometimes justice comes slowly, he reflected, but the truth, like metal beneath the soil, waits patiently to be discovered. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.